This is the story of how I found out I still had the power to save my son, 20 years after I thought I'd already given him everything I had to give. My son Daniel called me at 11 at night, and his voice was shaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 9 years old and locked himself out of the house in a thunderstorm. This time he wasn't 9. He was 34, sitting in a holding cell, accused of stealing from the company his father-in-law ran. And for a moment, before I said a single word back to him, I had to remind myself of something I hadn't thought about in years, that I still owned a piece of that company nobody else knew about. Let me back up, because you need to understand who Daniel is before you understand why this hit me the way it did. My son has never taken a shortcut in his life. When he was 16, he worked weekends at a hardware store and gave half his paycheck to his mother without being asked, because he noticed she was stretching grocery money. When he was 26, he drove 4 hours in the middle of the night to help a coworker whose car broke down on the highway, someone he barely knew, because he said nobody should be stranded alone in the dark. That's the kind of man my son is. Reliable to a fault. The kind of person who says yes before he's finished hearing the question, because helping people was never a decision for him, it was just who he was. Even as a kid, Daniel had this habit of putting himself last. I remember one Thanksgiving when he was maybe 12, he gave up his seat at the table for a neighbor kid whose family didn't have much that year, and ate standing at the counter without a word of complaint, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I used to worry, honestly, that a heart that soft would get taken advantage of someday. Turns out I was right to worry. I just didn't see where the danger would actually come from. I raised him mostly on my own after his mother and I divorced, and I made a promise to myself back then that I wouldn't hover over him the way my own father hovered over me. I wanted him to build his own life, make his own mistakes, stand on his own 2 feet without me constantly checking in to make sure he hadn't fallen. I thought that was respect. I thought that was love, done the quiet way. I didn't know yet that quiet love, without a floor underneath it, can look a lot like absence. Daniel married a wonderful woman named Sarah about 6 years ago. Her father, a man named Roger Ashford, owned a mid-sized logistics company, trucks, warehouses, regional freight contracts, the kind of business that had been built up over 30 years and looked solid from the outside. Not long after the wedding, Roger offered Daniel a management position at the company. I remember being genuinely happy for him. My son, given a real opportunity by his father-in-law, a chance to build something of his own inside a family that had welcomed him in. I didn't know there were conditions to that generosity. I didn't know that in Roger's mind, a job offer wasn't really a gift, it was a leash, and he expected to be the one holding it. For a few years, everything looked fine from where I stood. Daniel worked hard, like he always does. He'd call me sometimes just to talk about a new route he'd helped optimize, or a driver he'd gone out of his way to cover a shift for when the man's kid was sick. I was proud of him in the ordinary way a father is proud, from a comfortable distance, thinking distance was the respectful thing to maintain. Then came the discrepancy. Someone in the accounting department found a $4,000 gap in the fuel account tied to Daniel's depot. Instead of pulling records, checking the badge logs, or asking Daniel a single question, Roger went straight to his head of security and told him to build a case. Not investigate, build a case. There's a difference, and it's the difference between a father-in-law who trusts his son-in-law and one who's been looking for an excuse. 2 days later, police showed up at Daniel's house and arrested him in front of Sarah and their 6-year-old daughter. Sarah told me later that her own father hadn't even called her before it happened. She found out her husband was in handcuffs the same way the neighbors did, watching it happen through the front window. Roger never once picked up the phone to ask Daniel a single question directly. Not one. He let a security chief and a pair of officers do what a 5-minute conversation could have settled. That's the call I got that night. My son, in a holding cell, asking me, not for money, not for a lawyer, just asking, in a voice that had gone back to being 9 years old, whether I thought he was going to lose everything over something he didn't do. I want to be honest with you about something. My first instinct, even then, was to hold back. Old habits run deep. I thought, let him handle this with Sarah, let the lawyers sort it out. don't swoop in and make him feel like he can't manage his own life. I told myself that was respect again, that it took me exactly one night of not sleeping to realize that respecting your son's independence and abandoning him in the worst moment of his life are two very different things, and I had spent 34 years quietly confusing one for the other. So I made some calls of my own. There was a woman named Marjorie Tuck who'd worked at that company almost as long as it had existed, back office, payroll, the kind of employee who notices everything and says nothing until it matters. She'd always liked Daniel. He was one of the few managers who remembered her birthday and actually meant it. Marjorie went digging on her own time and found something Roger's security chief hadn't bothered to check. The badge reader at Daniel's depot had been malfunctioning for weeks, logging entries at random times, sometimes logging him in when he wasn't even on the property. She brought that straight to Daniel's attorney. That was the first crack in the case against him. But it wasn't what actually ended it. Here's the part of the story I never told Daniel, not for 6 years, because I didn't think he'd ever need to know it. Back when Roger's company was struggling to expand into a second regional market, before Daniel had even met Sarah, Roger needed a large private loan to keep the business afloat, the kind of loan a bank wouldn't touch without collateral he didn't have. A mutual acquaintance from my old banking days brought the deal to me. I put up the capital myself, quietly, through a holding company with my name nowhere on the paperwork Roger ever saw directly. In exchange, I wrote one clause into that agreement that Roger's own lawyer barely blinked at, because he never expected it to matter. If any employee were ever prosecuted without a documented internal investigation first, the debt holder had the right to assume operational control of the company until the matter was resolved. I hadn't thought about that clause in years. I'd forgotten I still held that leverage the same way you forget you own an old life insurance policy, until the day you actually need it. I called my attorney the morning after Daniel's arrest and told him to prepare to enforce it. Between Marjorie's evidence about the badge reader and my attorney's letter landing on Roger's desk, things moved fast. The prosecutor's office reviewed what little case there actually was, found it had no real legs to stand on, and dropped every charge against my son within the week. But I wasn't finished, and I want to tell you why. It would have been easy to let it end there, charges dropped, case closed, everyone quietly moves on and pretends the wound never happened. I've watched families do that before. Pretend the crisis passed clean. It never does. Someone has to answer for what almost happened to my son, or it happens again to somebody else's. I drove to Roger's office myself. I told him, for the first time, exactly who had kept his company alive years ago when no bank in the state would take his risk. I watched his face change as he realized the man sitting across from him wasn't just Daniel's father, he was the debt holder who'd been quietly watching his company from the shadows for 6 years, and now held the one clause that mattered most. I enforced it. Roger lost operational control of the company he thought was untouchably his. The security chief who'd built a case instead of investigating one was let go. Marjorie Tuck, the woman who actually cared enough to check the badge logs when nobody else would, was promoted into a role where her instincts would finally be worth something. It took Roger almost 2 months before he could bring himself to apologize to Daniel and Sarah directly. When he finally did, it wasn't much, a stiff conversation over coffee, an admission that he'd acted first and thought second, but Daniel accepted it, because that's who my son is. Better than me, in some ways. More forgiving than I've ever managed to be. Sarah took longer to forgive her father, and I don't blame her for that. There's a particular kind of hurt in watching your own parent choose suspicion over you when it counted most, and no coffee conversation smooths that over in a week. But she and Daniel are still together, still raising their daughter, and Roger has learned, slowly, and only because he had no choice left, what it actually costs to run a family business like it's a courtroom instead of a home. I think about that thunderstorm phone call from when he was 9 sometimes, and the one from the holding cell 25 years later, and I realize now they were the same call, really. A son reaching out in the dark, asking if his father was still there. The only difference is that the second time, I almost didn't answer the way I should have. I almost let my idea of respecting his independence cost him everything. If there's one thing I'd want another father listening to this to take with him, it's this: giving your children space to build their own lives is not the same thing as disappearing when they need you most. Sometimes the most important thing you can do as a father isn't teaching your son how to stand on his own, it's making sure he knows, without question, that you're still standing right behind him, holding something in reserve, ready the moment he actually needs it. I let Daniel build his own life for 34 years. But the day it mattered most, I was still his father, quietly holding the one thing that could save him. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear about a time you had to quietly step in for someone you love. And if you want more stories like this one, stay with me, there are more to tell.